This presentation, Ukrainian Architecture, Pride of Place in a Nation Under Siege, was delivered on Sunday, January 8, 2023, by Professor Stephen Rugare, College of Architecture and Environmental Design, Kent State University. This presentation was part of a larger omnibus program, Dear Ukraine, a global community poem and celebration of Ukrainian poetry, literature, and culture, sponsored by the Lakewood Public Library, the Ukrainian Museum Archives Cleveland, and Kent State University's Wick Poetry Center, School of Peace and Conflict Studies, and College of Architecture and Environmental Design. Join Professor Rugare in an exploration of the rich and sometimes conflicting traditions of Ukrainian architecture, including Soviet-era modern architecture in a nation embracing Ukrainization. Tragically, much of this architecturally and culturally significant built environment has been damaged or destroyed, or is under imminent threat of loss.
So I've entitled this Ukraine's Cosmopolitan Architecture at Risk, and the reason for that title is, first of all, to make the point that there is a lot of architecture from a lot of different traditions of significance in Ukraine, but also because the notion that there is a national style or a national tradition of architecture is something that people persistently expect to see, and Ukraine doesn't fit that pattern very well. Ukraine has, like many countries, always been a kind of crossroads. A lot of people have moved through, starting with the ancient Greeks, the Romans, all of the various migratory tribes of the Middle Ages. Parts of Ukraine have been ruled by Austria. So it's not surprising that there is a pretty wide range of architectural influences visible in the country. There is work in the south of Ukraine by the great Muslim architect Sinan, the architect of a number of major buildings in Istanbul. There are major Roman archaeological sites and so on. That idea of national style or national architecture or culture is very much a 19th century idea. And it was an idea that was actually very much embraced in Russia. So the notion of Russian national style, when you see St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow or some of the other Russian religious buildings, St. Basil's dates from the Renaissance, but there are other buildings that were from the 19th century that are pastiches of what was imagined to be national style. I think that's important because the richness of the architecture in Ukraine is partly the result of a number of influences and a number of regimes. In addition, during the period when Ukraine was part of the Russian Empire before World War I, the architectural culture of Russia in the 18th and early 19th centuries looked very much to Western Europe for guidance. So on the list of threatened or damaged buildings, there are a number of buildings like this, which are Orthodox religious monuments. And understandably, these get a lot of attention. There was an article in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago that mentioned several of them. Even these, though, are really quite stylistically varied. There are often elements that reflect architecture of farther west. On this building, for example, you can see this classical pediment in the front over the doorway, and other details that are typical of the Western tradition, combined with a plan that's typical of Eastern Orthodoxy and the onion domes and so on. The same is true here with a building with an onion dome that has a steeple that looks like a church in London a little bit. These are both buildings that have been significantly damaged. they will almost certainly be repaired and have a high priority for being repaired. That said, there is some evidence that religious buildings are being targeted, including, oddly enough, on the list, several buildings of the Jehovah's Witnesses. I don't know why that is, but it does seem like somebody's going after them. But I want to focus more on the buildings that are typical of modern urban expansion in Ukraine. So the 1800s, particularly the period after 1850 and up till World War I, was a period of rapid economic and urban growth in Ukraine and other parts of Eastern Europe. And in many ways, it's the architecture of that period that sets the tone for the cores of cities like Lviv, Odessa, Kyiv, and so on. This is not onion domes and church towers. Instead, it's buildings like this. Buildings designed by architects who are emulating the historicist architecture of the West. And by historicist, I mean architecture of the 19th century that uses past historical styles to, in a sense, tell a story about who the people of the present are. So, locally, you could think of the Gothic styles of some of the grand churches along Detroit Avenue and Lakewood, or the classical styles of the buildings around the mall in downtown Cleveland, the group plan. The Opera House in Odessa is a good example. As far as I know, it hasn't been damaged, and in fact, I've read that they're actually performing. But it shows the degree to which Odessa, as a port city, something of a resort city, and a multi-ethnic city, was very interested in cultural institutions and highly cosmopolitan. So the Opera House here is very similar to one of the most famous opera houses of the 19th century, the Semperoper in Dresden, the work of the famous German architect Gottfried Semper. And you can see very clear reminiscences here. That's, I think, a pretty interesting case where the desire to have the latest from further west is obvious. It's usually less obvious. The architects synthesize a lot of influences. This is another big building in the center of Odessa. As I said, these buildings really set the tone in a lot of these cities. They are often classical. They use columns and the elements of classical buildings, but they're usually covered in plaster and stucco, which is painted pastel colors. And that really sets a tone, I think, for a lot of cities in Eastern Europe, Odessa included. Not surprisingly, since these buildings are in the center of town, a lot of them house major institutions, government institutions, and so on. A lot of them are being damaged. This building, the Palace of Labor in Kharkiv, was heavily damaged very early in the war, within the first couple of weeks, and maybe salvageable. It's a little hard to tell, and I doubt that in many cases people have been able to do those kinds of surveys. As I say, these buildings really set the tone for the city core in a place like Kharkiv. And the loss of a good number of them will have a tremendous effect. It might be that no particular building is that significant, really stands out as a treasure. But when you lose a bunch of them, you lose the character of a place very quickly. In the theory of historic preservation, we very much recognize the idea that saving individual monuments without their context, without the history that produced them, is a very incomplete approach to preservation. And these buildings, of course, are on the whole less likely to be rebuilt in their form or rebuilt at all, when they can probably be more cheaply demolished and replaced. The lists I've seen so far make no mention of Ukraine's wealth of progressive architecture of the period around 1900. This is a special interest of mine. I'm teaching a course on it, not just Ukraine, but Europe generally. There is a lot of Art Nouveau architecture in Ukraine. Again, these cities were growing. This building in Kherson, which, based on what I've read about Kherson, could well be gone, is an apartment building. You can see its condition wasn't great before the war. It is, typical of a kind of architecture that was built in many European cities. Usually they are commercial buildings. Some are schools and museums and institutional buildings. And they have an interesting history in that in many cities they are associated with populations who are wealthy, business owners, but who are not the cultural elite necessarily. So in much of Eastern Europe, Art Nouveau architecture was particularly patronized by Jews. The Jewish community in Vienna, the Jewish community in Budapest, in Krakow, in other cities, particularly was drawn to this architecture as a way of stating their own modernity, their interest in having innovative and reforming styles of buildings, but also as a way of perhaps setting themselves apart from the sort of official culture. This is true in Russia as well. In Moscow, the Art Nouveau architecture was mostly built by members of the sect of the Old Believers, a sect that was persecuted in the 18th century, but in the late 19th century, members of the sect became quite wealthy. They were, of course, all shipped to Siberia by Stalin later on. The variety of Art Nouveau architecture in Ukraine is really incredible. It's not very well known, and there's very little written on it in French or English or German. This is the house in Mariupol, quite typical of the style. There's probably a good deal of florid detail on it that we can't see very well in this photo. You can see the round glass and iron canopy up above, which is a very typical feature of Art Nouveau. This house is verified as having been destroyed, again, these are buildings that would be very expensive to restore, and also, again, are probably not recognized as the highest priority. But they tell a really important cultural story. Here, a bank building in Chernihiv, which, again, has a number of interesting features. The stonework of the lower story is something it shares actually with the reforming architecture of Finland at this moment, and Finland was also part of the Russian Empire. There also is an architecture that fuses the traditional wooden architecture of Ukraine with new stylistic influences. And this is an example in Chernihiv. And Chernihiv is in the east of the country, the area that's been most heavily involved in the war. Dnipro as well. And many of these buildings have really interesting ornamental devices on them that show that these architects were not simply imitating influences from Vienna or Paris. They are inventing new ideas. If I zoom in here a little bit, get it to zoom, there we go. This sort of device with the two round elements holding the square element up, it's almost in the mode of later architecture of the Soviet avant-garde, where they work with simple geometric forms, but here it's used in the context of a fairly traditional building format. This is in Kharkiv, and it shows another phenomenon. The architects of this movement often would design what are considered utilitarian buildings, like factories. Many of their patrons would ask for a house and then ask for a factory or a store. And we often find buildings like this one in Kharkiv. This one I picked out because it has ceramic decoration, which has narrative, folkloric elements in it. So these are ceramic tiles at the upper level of the building. They are by Mikhail Frubel. Frubel is one of the most famous Russian artists of the period, a leader of the development of arts and crafts in Russia. These buildings contain elements of the Russian story as well. That's, I think, an important thing to remember as we learn more about their fate. This is another one in Kharkiv that I thought was quite striking. The ornament is ceramic tiles of different colors simply placed in a pattern. And that, again, is something that's pretty radical for the time, anticipating the kinds of things you might see in the work of the Bauhaus, for example, in another 15 years after this. After World War I, of course, and the Russian Revolution, there is a very different architecture promoted. For a few years in the 1920s, the arts in the Soviet Union were wildly inventive, very freewheeling, and were exemplary for avant-garde artists and architects in Western Europe. We refer to these movements kind of generally as under the umbrella of constructivism. Actually, there were thousands of, well, not thousands, but probably hundreds of movements. It seems like a new art movement was being promoted in Moscow about every 3 weeks during this period. Some of the most important buildings are in Ukraine, particularly in Kharkiv. Although the Soviet regime technically promoted Ukraine as a nationality, there was a Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. The Ukrainian language was allowed to be taught in schools, which it had not been under the Tsar. Nevertheless, Kharkiv, a more Russian city, Russian-speaking city, was given a lot of investment by the Soviet regime, as if they were trying to build it up as more important than Kyiv. And part of that was this massive building, the Palace of Industry, the Dershprom, completed in 1928. It's one of the largest, if not the largest, modernist buildings completed during the 1920s. It consists of 6 large tower blocks joined together by bridges and other elements. It's arranged in a semicircle around a huge plaza, clearly intended as a major propagandistic statement. Very intentionally, it is detailed in the most utilitarian way: factory windows, simple white walls, and so on. Depending on how you photograph it, it can look kind of grandly traditional in its arrangement, or it can look really wild. If you photograph it on oblique angles, like in the photograph on the right, it looks like the photographs and architectural drawings of a lot of the more radical architects of the period. This building was photographed and was widely published in the West, although it was really, in a sense, atypical. Much of the architecture of the avant-garde in Russia was either quite small or was never actually built at all. And by the time these pictures, the black and white photo was taken in the mid-30s, Stalin had long since forbade any sort of architecture like this in favor of traditional historicist architecture. It turns out that building, by the way, I know has been damaged. I saw an aerial photograph of it. One of the blocks was bombed out. It's probably too big to be completely destroyed, but it's certainly threatened. It turns out Kharkiv has the most built work of this period of any city in the former Soviet Union. These are just a couple of examples. The one on the left is a workers' club. The one on the right is an apartment building. So the architects active in Kharkiv were not only part of this globally famous avant-garde, but they were the ones who were really realizing the most of their work. Now, if you've seen any coverage of the war, you've undoubtedly seen a building like this damaged. Happens to be in Kharkiv. These are apartment buildings built by the Soviet regime after World War II. So after Stalin dies in the early 50s, the Soviet government embraces a more modern approach, and a big campaign of the Soviet and Eastern Bloc governments was to provide housing. And it took the form of these big blocks, these slabs of concrete, and they had a lot of prefabricated components in them. Often they were built rather poorly. It's not unusual for the design to not really match the landscapes, so you might have to go down steps to get to your front door, for example, because they were, really mass-produced. Nevertheless, there are a huge number of housing units. They're found outside of every city in Russia, Ukraine, the Czech Republic, East Germany. At the time, they played a really important role for people. So they have a place in the collective memory. You have to imagine a situation in which you were married, still living in your parents' tiny apartment, and all of a sudden you could get a new apartment with new plumbing, new sinks, new appliances in one of these buildings. Now, are they the nicest buildings in the world? No. But that was a pretty big deal for people. Many, many people have lived their lives in these buildings, and the events of their lives have happened there. And they are simply, they provided and provide a huge number of housing units. So the loss of one of these buildings is a big challenge for reconstruction. This is an example of the same type of building not damaged here in Dresden. And here, Mariupol, we know Mariupol has been largely flattened, including large numbers of these buildings, which, as I say, are not very high quality architecture and probably are not totally loved by very many people. But nevertheless, it played an important role in history and played an important practical role. There are also buildings like this, again from the late Soviet era, these sculptural concrete institutional buildings built in cities large and small, all over the place. And there is a bit of a vogue for these in architectural circles. They've been sort of rediscovered. Whether that's a good thing, I don't know. But they again are, important buildings. They house institutions. There's cultural centers. They play an important role in the lives of people. one of the big challenges of reconstruction will be, I think, really dealing with how to replace these buildings, what to replace them with in the cases where they're destroyed. The information on this one is sort of unclear. So I wanted to keep this relatively short because this is a pretty packed program, but I hope that gave you some sense of the architectural heritage of Ukraine, but also of some of the challenges. I think the most important challenges really are not the famous religious monuments, things like that. It's more the intangible urban context that's created by groupings of buildings, by whole neighborhoods of buildings, that will be a struggle in some of these cities that have been so seriously damaged, particularly in the East.
This concludes Professor Rugare's presentation, Ukrainian Architecture, Pride of Place in a Nation Under Siege. For more information about Dear Ukraine, a global community poem, visit dearukrainepoem.com. Add your poem to Dear Ukraine, as hundreds around the world have done.